All right, hello, welcome back, everybody. PayPal, Patreon, and the YouTube Super, whatever links are down below. If you want to support me, only do so if you actually can. And if you want access to the graphs used in this video, or hundreds of other similar graphs across different subjects or similar subjects, those are all available for free in the Drive folder linked in the description. Any support helps with the maintenance and upkeep of all that as well. So first, oil production levels update for 2026 for non-OPEC members, that is, starting with a former OPEC member, Angola, who left the group 2 years ago as they did not want to continue following the indefinite production cuts regime. Angola peaked up around 2 million barrels per day and has declined since then, down close to 1, although they're just managing to hold themselves above 1. They went below it recently, but have recovered just back above. And with the recent startup of a new 25 or 30,000 barrel per day field, they actually managed to get back up to 1.1 million barrels per day. By the end of the decade, 4 years from now, they'll probably be down more around 800,000. Azerbaijan peaked up at around 1.1, and over the last decade and a half, they have declined down under 600, now halfway down through the 500,000s, this time coming in at 556,000 barrels per day. Argentina had peaked up close to 900, declined down to 400 conventionally, but ever since fracking operations started in the Vaca Muerta shale a few years ago, they have brought Argentina back up close to the 900 of previous times. They got as high as 864. This time they came in a bit below that, coming back down to 850. But regardless, it has made Argentina a net exporter again, as their domestic oil consumption levels, their own oil demand, are usually around 700,000 barrels per day in present day. Australia was once up at 800 around its peak, and they've declined all the way down now to around the mid 200,000s, although this time with some likely maintenance shutdowns, they dropped abruptly below 200 down to 184,000. Brazil, just at the end of last year, had gotten over 4 million barrels per day, up to 4.03. And now, as they have started production of a 180,000 barrel per day field expansion project, that should be taking them obviously just up to or just over 4.2. Canada is back up to and continuing to stay around 5.2, and a number of continued tar sands expansion projects will bring them up by another couple 100,000 barrels per day this year to either 5.4 or 5.5, depending on how fast things are able to get done. China continuing to cling to life in the lower fours, this time coming in around 4.3 again at 4.32 million barrels per day. Meanwhile, their domestic oil consumption is up around 17 or 18 million barrels per day on average. Although their demand is now peaking or plateauing, it is still well and far beyond a point where they're ever going to be meeting their own domestic supplies again. Colombia, on its way down from its second peak of 1 million barrels per day, has declined down into the mid 700,000s, this time coming in at 752, and their export margin continues to shrink as their domestic consumption levels, their own demand nowadays, is averaging over 500,000. Ecuador also seeing their margin shrink as they have very gradually declined down their terminal decline slope from their all-time peak of 550 down to around 460 or 470 now, while their domestic oil consumption has made it up into the lower 300s. Egypt was once up at around 900,000. They declined over time down to around 500,000. They were getting really close to it. They've had a sudden bump back up, this time to 519. So we'll see if that stays, if that was a new small field in the Western Desert being brought on or not. Ghana's oil production is now at around 182 after hitting a peak of 214, declining down to 150, and some enhanced recovery stuff bringing it back up to 190 before falling down to 182 now. But I believe either this year or next year, A new field offshore is being brought online that should jump them up to about 250. Guyana will be going up further this year as well. They're now up to around 900,000 barrels per day. Another new field that's being brought online later this year in the second half. Decently sized, as pretty much every field offshore of Guyana has been. It will bring them up over 1 million barrels per day to somewhere between 1 million and 1.1. India, while their own oil demand is now just short of 6 million, their production plateaued at its highest point close to 800,000 for a few decades, but has declined down to around 600, although they are stalling it here, and what they're finding and bringing online offshore has been enough to keep it from going down further, at least for the moment. This time it had a sudden drop down to 579. Indonesia, once a decent producer back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, at around 1.6 million barrels per day for a few decades, have declined since then down to only around 600. Meanwhile, their own domestic consumption is midway between 2 and 2.5, making their way up towards 2.5 million barrels per day. Kazakhstan had made it up to about 2.2 million barrels per day, although just recently they've had a number of different shutdowns, seen them take an abrupt drop back down under 1.9, coming in this time at 1.87 million barrels per day. Malaysia, once up around 800,000, had declined down into the upper mid 400,000s. However, some new stuff and some enhanced recovery works have recently jumped them back up to the lower mid 500,000s, this time coming in at 542. Mexico peaked up at around 3.5 and had declined and plateaued and declined further a few times. And now, for the last roughly 7-8 years, has been undulating around in the upper ones area between 1.6 and 1.9 roughly, this time coming in at 1.74, and their domestic oil consumption, their own demand, is now back up over 1.8. Norway staying up over 2 million after bringing online that large field in their Arctic waters a few months ago, this time coming in at 2.07. Oman continuing to hold roughly around 1, coming in this time at 1.01 million barrels per day. Qatar, another former member who left OPEC because they were tired of Saudi Arabia's orders for basically permanent production cut regimes, and they, after leaving, brought themselves up into the 1 millions area, and after hitting a high of about 1.5, they declined down to around 1.3, but have stalled themselves from declining further, this time continuing to come in at 1.32. Russia, before invading Ukraine, was back up to about 11 million barrels per day, had to drop down to 10 almost immediately because of European customer absence. And in the aftermath of invading Ukraine, in the now nearly 4 years since then, after all the outside oil industries left, Russia has not been able to keep it going and has gradually slipped further and further down, despite eventually hitting a point where they declared their oil production data classified and just publicly insisted since then for about a year now that they just stayed at exactly 9 million barrels per day and have never slipped further than that. They have slipped down to around 8.5 and were likely a little bit above it, but now that they've taken drone strike hits on some of their Caspian Sea production facilities, that has seen them lose over 100,000 barrels per day of capacity. So that has them coming in likely just a bit below 8.5 million barrels per day. Turkmenistan, after peaking in the mid or upper 200,000s, had slipped down to around 190. But over the course of last year, they were able to increase their production back upwards somewhat, not by a lot though, from 191 up to now about 203,000. The UK, long fallen from its North Sea heights, is down now to only around 700 or below 700,000 barrels per day usually. This time, however, because of likely a number of maintenance shutdowns at larger operations, they came in all the way down to 477,000. The US has entered its wobbly peak plateau range, coming in again roughly around 13.8 in the expected area. And since shale has reached its limit, the constant upward drive is gone and has been replaced by the beginnings of a constant downward pull. So U.S. production has entered a pattern now of every few months, a new field gets added offshore or back up home in Alaska on the North Slope that causes U.S. production to suddenly jump. And then from there, the decline immediately resumes. And the decline has been pretty consistent at between 10 and 15,000 barrels per day of production per week, which rounding down for safety works out to about a decline of 500 to 600,000 barrels per day per year in the absence of those random upward boosts, again, from singular large offshore or Alaska North Slope fields. So the EIA's expectation that the total net decline this year will only be 100 or 200,000 barrels per day will probably end up being true, but as we go 1, 2, 3 more years forward, that negative downward pull from shale hitting the opposite side of its slope is only going to get stronger. And Vietnam, once held a plateau in the 300,000s for a few decades, has declined from that all the way down to the upper mid 100s now, this time coming in at 172. Meanwhile, their own domestic oil consumption is nearly up to about 800,000 barrels per day. All right, that's it for this one. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal, Patreon, YouTube, Super, whatever, financial buttons are all down there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. There's a link to the Drive folder with all the graphs and hundreds of other graphs for you to access for free in the description. There's a link to my cat's YouTube channel in the top pinned comment. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.